Greetings and welcome back to room 303. We turn in your hymnals for just a few seconds to pages 1362, 1363. Let's learn a little bit about the Poet Laureate. We mentioned that Stanley Kunitz is a Poet Laureate. Let's introduce ourselves to this idea. I'm just reading with you at the top of page 1362. Down the left-hand side there, you'll see pictures of several of the individuals who have served as Poet Laureate. Rita Dove, one of those people who we will read in a while, says, "Being Poet Laureate made me realize I was capable of a larger voice. There is a more public utterance I can make as a poet." Let's read about the Poet Laureates. An ancient symbol is the first heading. The ancient Greeks adorned their heroes, whether athletes or poets, with wreaths made of laurel leaves. Today, the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. honors one American poet each year with the title of Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry. The word laureate invokes those ancient wreaths of laurels. Although Britain has been naming poet laureates since the year 1630, the United States did not name one until 1937. The first American poet laureate was Joseph Alexander, though at first the official title was simply consultant in poetry. Famous American poets who have held the post include Robert Frost, Gwendolyn Brooks, and of course Stanley Kunitz, who we just did. The next heading, the early years of the poetry consultancy. When the position was first established, the consultant was not expected to perform many duties beyond overseeing in a general way the poetry collection of the Library of Congress. Unlike the British Poet Laureate, who is required to write poems for state occasions such as the Queen's birthday, the American Laureate has never been asked to write official poetry or preside over events of state. In the beginning, the position was largely honorary. Over time, some of the appointed poets began to make a larger role for themselves. In 1945, Louise Bogan, the first woman named to the post, made audio recordings of poets reading from their work for the library's poetry archives. She convinced W.H. Auden and T.S. Eliot to record some of their poems, and she also recorded her own. Leonie Adams, in 1948, was the first to establish the tradition of having a public poetry reading early in the year. When Robert Frost was appointed in 1958, he took a more public stance, calling press conferences and speaking with the Attorney General on behalf of poet Ezra Pound, who was incarcerated at the time. Shortly after his term expired, Frost read a poem at the inauguration of President John F. Kennedy, and of course we did this right on page 884, thereby bringing poetry into the homes of television viewers across the nation. Maxine Kumin, who served in 1981, started a series of women's poetry workshops at the Poetry and Literature Center. Gwendolyn Brooks, who in 1985 became the first black woman to serve in the post, arranged for poetry reading luncheons and brought poems into elementary schools. I'm on now page 1363, the laureate's changing role. The Poet Laureate's job is to promote the enjoyment of poetry throughout America by encouraging people to read and write poetry. Each laureate has interpreted the job in a different way. In 1991, concerned that only a small number of Americans were reading poetry, Laureate Joseph Brodsky started a program to distribute free poetry books to motels and schools. Robert Haas was dubbed the first activist laureate in 1995 when he traveled across the country, speaking to civics groups and visiting businesses to raise money for literacy programs. 2 years later, Laureate Robert Penske invited Americans to share their favorite poems by reading them on tape and video. He published them in An Invitation to Poetry, a book packaged with a DVD. Rita Dove in 1999 brought children to the Library of Congress to read and record their poems for the archives. Ted Kooser launched the American Life and Poetry Project, which made a poem available every week for newspapers to print, while Billy Collins created a website where high school students could find a new poem every day of the school year. I would recommend that all of these poets that are mentioned, and of course even our current Poet Laureate Herrera, that you take a look at these poets and read a little bit of what they have to say. Google them. Take a look. Well, there you go, an introduction to Poet Laureates and the history of poetry in America. Thank you.